This is part 2 of the top 25 worst Friendship is Magic episodes countdown. If you've not seen the first part, click the link in the description to catch up. Without further ado, let's find out what the creme de la crap of this series was. Oh, Season 9, you had one job, to tie up loose ends and make conclusions out of whatever you could muster. You took one look at Garble and thought, yeah, let's give him a chance to right the wrongs of the past. The intent was good, but boy did they make a mistake putting it into practice. It was imperative that Garble and Spike bury the hatchet somehow. While they could have taken these two into a battlefield to finally settle the score, have Garble's actions make him dig his own figurative and morally eye-opening grave, or get a combination of both, what we got instead was the most shoehorned and tonally dissonant form of villain reformation that this show has ever done, by barely even trying to actually go through with it at all. Out of all potential scenarios, exposing Garble as a sensitive poet trying to look tough to conform with his social norms was not on my bingo card, and not only was it out of character, its story spearheaded into the ground due to its ham-fisted, idiotic method of conveying it. A protracted series of unfortunate events soured any feeling of empathy that could be salvaged, all because Garble retained face by being a dick the entire time, showing no real sign of reluctance within himself, meaning all of Spike and Smolder's attempts at helping just felt weak and pointless. Revealing himself as Smolder's brother should have added a feather to its bow, but it doesn't help. Another forced tactic wedged into a gap that was way too small to yield any positive results. Fluttershy and Ember's failed attempts to warrant some laughter and occasional seriousness to it all further complicated the tonal imbalance to ring home just how out of touch it all was. Ending an episode on a message of being confident to express yourself should have been obvious, only to have the worst Deus Ex Machina in terms of moral implications loosely attempting to tie two distant plot threads together but failing massively reinforced just how unsettlingly irrelevant Sweet and Smoky was as a whole. What could have been a rousing, profound and touching reflection on a hate-sink's actions turned into one where a page was barely turned at all, while cheap shocks and laughs couldn't save an episode that was dead on arrival before it had even passed its first act, only getting worse and more absurd from there. The last showcase of the Dragonlands in this series was Sweet and Smoky, which in my personal opinion was an absolute farce, and given the character at the centre of it, how bloody fitting was that? There were times when I was reviewing this show where I'd look at an episode's synopsis, especially if it was an upcoming one, and already know it would be a bust, especially when it felt like it would be a retread of a prior episode. In this case, well, it definitely lived up to expectation on that front, because after watching the Cutie Mark Crusaders interfere in Big Mac's love life in Hearts and Hooves Day in Season 2, and thinking it was a fun enough romp, I wondered to myself, why the blue hell would you do it again, only this time far worse? Well, sometimes you can get a bit too eager with the concept to want to execute it again, and the results of which can be pretty dire. Reuniting the Cutie Mark Crusaders and their peeping Tom attitude of forcibly assisting in Big Mac's love life at least had a different setting and a willing participant this time to make it feel less stale 5 seasons after its predecessor, and equally impressive, made it a love triangle to further reinforce the apparent freshness of it all. However, much like the freezers on Kitchen Nightmares, the longer you leave something on ice, the more damage it'll take upon being thawed, to where, upon once it's consumed, you will end up wanting to retch. It's hard for me to really say anything about hard to say anything without that actually happening. And whilst Hearts and Hooves Day had its fun taking the piss out of romantic story cliches and offering up a great moral about not messing in someone's affairs despite good intentions, which meant it got a respectable score on my end of things, here all goodwill evaporated using Profession of Love in the most cringiest and laboured way possible, and good sweet lord was it hard to watch. Agonisingly slow in its execution, with stale environments and appalling ideas on the plate, even an elaborate genre-combining musical number couldn't save this one from crashing, as if felt like it was spinning in circles until they realised that all that bullshit meant absolutely nothing and that simple gestures are the best thing you can do. Remember the Big Mac question? You copied that from this, and you executed it just as poorly. They say that the best things always come in pairs. I call bull on that. Anyway, with the seriousness ramped up, it took away from what made Hearts and Hooves Day so enjoyable despite its average showing, all things considered. This was just so insipid and felt like it was never going to end as it retrod the same ground with much less ingenuity. And I have to ask this question: why a fully grown stallion is taking dating advice from three little fillies is beyond me. Why we needed a sequel that turned into an entire saga is also beyond me. Either way, this did give us the Sugar Belle Big Mac relationship arc, but outside of that outcome, this was a flagrant and tired reason to revive something which could have been much better handled if there was some dexterity and creativity to it. I still can't watch this one back without wincing. No wonder it's ended up as low as this. Yikes. In later seasons, some episodes were weighted down with retroactive continuity that pokes holes in the lore that was already established from prior seasons. For example, why isn't Fluttershy selected as a judge in Honest Apple when she exhibited fashion knowledge even Rarity couldn't believe in Suited for Success? That would have made much more sense than throwing Applejack into it. Why did the dragon in Dragonshy crack so easily under the weight of being yelled at by Fluttershy when dragons are so emotionally resolute and don't give a shit? Why was Fluttershy unable to talk to animals in The Best Night Ever, given that in every subsequent episode since then, she could? Wow, Fluttershy really was at fault for quite a few of these. No wonder her character suffered so many issues later on. Anyway, they are the tip of the iceberg, as the one that defined our number 10 entry is, in my opinion, reprehensible. Why, you may be asking? Well, if the writers could explain to me why they threw the moral of Four Weather Friends off a cliff just to give us an excuse to see Rainbow Dash and Applejack fight again, I would appreciate it, before openly proclaiming just how unbelievably short-sighted it was. If the core concept of the plot feels like a manufactured event, then why should I give a damn? For long-time viewers of this series, non-compete clause feels like a spit in the face, especially when these two are taken out of a suitable setting for this to play out, and in the process undermine the development of new characters just so they can remind you who really matters in this show. I could redeem their bungled efforts despite their convoluted nature if they just stuck the landing. Sadly, they ramshackled a moral out of their arses that makes all involved feel like they're emotionally repressing their true feelings just so they can conveniently avoid punishment for their actions and make a good ending from something that was doomed to fail from the pre-intro. This is an episode that rarely has anything good to say about it, and while the sight of seeing the Student 6 for the first time since the Season 8 premiere was nice, to have them overshadowed by characters who already had their day in the sun was so oppressive to where minimal moments of happiness were constantly dwarfed by big-headed ponies jostling for a position that wasn't theirs to have. It's an episode that fails to entertain, fails to give our noobs some sustenance, and fails to grasp its outdated characterization with humor and critique. It also has a massive 9-month time skip that ruined my entire idea on how time and the yearly cycle of Equestria works in this series. Thanks for that, I really appreciate it. Non-compete clause is the example of an episode where one calamitous mistake has rendered it completely useless, and it could have been easily rectified by doing one thing: ensuring that all new writing hires watched every single episode that aired prior to the season from an episode they would be working on, because that is the one thing that sent this episode onto a downward spiral that it could not recover from. I mean, seriously, Kim Bear-Johnson, the person who wrote this episode, her first MLP writing credit, if you had seen Season 1's Four Weather Friends, you would have known that this type of thing had already been tackled, meaning it would not have felt as stale, bland, and frustrating to watch as a viewer would do, aka what I experienced. And it showed me something quite Well, disappointing, in that at season 8, this show was starting to run out of ideas, meaning that every single time I went into a new episode, after this point, I was looking forward to seeing what wasn't dug from the same hole or pulled from the same well as the prior episodes had done, because it meant I could judge them on their creativity, on their nuance, on their ability to adapt to continuity and everything else surrounding it. This episode, that wasn't the case, and it left me really befuddled, to be honest, and the fact that this episode did as bad as it did as a result of it is disappointing. The fact it didn't even crack the top 10, or at least barely managed to, is quite worrying, because it means we still have further to fall. Sometimes less is more, and it looks like someone didn't fully get the memo when putting this episode to script, as the laborious The One Where Pinkie Pie Knows is as taxing as an episode of the show that the long-winded title openly mocks. The premise of Pinkie Pie trying to keep a secret from spilling might have actually worked if we didn't know what it was. Thank you, piece of laboured scripting in the pre-intro. Thank you, synopsis, which foreshadowed it. Good lord, all the mystery of this episode was gone. If we were not allowed to figure out what it was until it actually came out in episode, then all the subtext given by Pinkie, reacting to certain words, and all the symbolic imagery she encountered would have actually had some weight to it, rather than making you want to punch all involved for lacking the subtlety needed to not drill this concept into your head as you feel as flustered and as stressed as Party Horse does throughout. It makes you so uncomfortable to where you just want to end it, and while it does try to add some comedy to alleviate the pressure, it's hardly a reprieve, and when Shining Armor seemingly puts you and Ponka out of your misery, the whole unnecessary circus starts up again! Oh god! It just saps your energy, but not in a good way, as the moral clearly wrote the story and, well, just left its bare framework to pick up the minimal scraps that were left behind. As a result, it sleepwalks into its own inadequacy by making a momentous and significant moment not feel like it, because by its end you just don't care, as the characters absent-mindedly crushed your patience whilst the music and visuals barely even turned up to help. While I can fully appreciate the message having some value to those at home who are blabbermouths who could honestly learn something from this, it was so poorly put together that its issues ring out so much, to the point where suffering tinnitus is seen as a better option, which is definitely something I can't attest to, seeing as I have tinnitus. Anyway, the concept of this episode was a sound one, but the wrong pieces were inserted into the jigsaw, leading to a crushing disappointment that left my head hurting when trying to comprehend why they couldn't have handled this with some semblance of realism and decency. I can fully grasp what this episode wanted to do, and fully appreciate what it bequeathed afterwards, because without it, this adorable bundle of joy wouldn't exist. If they just figured out a streamlined and more fun way of presenting the process of getting to it without feeling like a colossal waste of time and energy, then maybe it would have had a chance at a greater score. Instead, it just dug its own grave out of sheer ignorance to its own blatant problems. This is what happens when an episode like the one where Pinkie Pie Knows has a concept that isn't fleshed out to where it isn't feasibly able to sustain itself. And boy, has this show made that apparent, and it's done so more than enough times over the years to where this just feels like the absolute nadir of the process. Despite the wide-ranging audience that this show has amassed over the years, I have to remember that the target demographic for Friendship is Magic is young children, so as a result, the stories featured in a show like this have to appeal to them first and foremost, which makes an episode about looking after babies with no real sense of fun provoke confusion of the highest order. From the first moment of this show right to its conclusion, it's apparent that Pinkie Pie, even at the best of times, can still be annoying when it's not necessarily appropriate. In this case, oh dear lord is that apparent, because thrusting her into a job that she's clearly not ready for, and her constant striving to want to prove that she is, doesn't make our sympathy grow, especially as the two little blobs she's looking after are the most conveniently annoying and destructive little shits known to man. And instead of offering us some fun, frivolous slice of life that these characters could have provided if utilised to the best of their abilities, Baby Cakes resolutely stuck to a mantra and formula that was doomed to fail from the start. Pinky pisses you off with her antics, the babies scream. Rinse and repeat for most of its runtime until you end up facepalming your entire head into another dimension. And do not even mention that bloody pig song, because good god, my ears needed a lot of intensive cleaning after that monstrosity. Amazingly though, the third act took on a magically influenced combination of The Exorcist and Trainspotting that provided some tonal contrast and a way for the message about taking on responsibility and proving your abilities because some people trusted you, showed that this did have some legs to eventually stand on, but boy did they arrive late to try and save the day and prevent an episode that felt like gargling bleach with its obstinate and divergent delivery from suffering further embarrassment. This episode may have given us Pound and Pumpkin Cake, but after this you can see why they were never a focus again. Hell, if you want to see babysitting in this show executed with much more enjoyment, Season 7's A Flurry of Emotions handles it with much more care and allows us some breaks from the burdensome mayhem instead of torturing you for its entire duration. This is the example of an episode that from the moment it set its sights on what it wanted to give you was destined to fail. And it's also what happens when two annoying things sap the energy and life out of whatever it's attached to, which is a perfect allegory for children now you think about it. Apologies to all parents who are watching this. Baby Cakes is an example of this show when it doesn't even read its target audience properly, alienating all who would subsequently gaze upon it. The fact that in the eyes of many, this episode ranks consistently as low as it does indicates just how uninteresting and out of touch it was. Honestly, who the hell thought this was a good idea? Once again, I have to retread familiar ground and reiterate to you a point of contention that happened in the first part of this countdown, and it's that an episode that is bad can be rectified and saved by changing one thing about it. However, all those prior examples that I mentioned had their template born from what this episode laid before me. Now, Spike at Your Service is not a good episode. Most people can tell you that if they've seen it. But I know for a fact that if Rarity was the focus of it, instead of Applejack, it would not have suffered as appallingly as it ended up doing. Rarity mentioning out loud that she would love to be waited on by hand and feet by somebody should have been an indication that the writers had made a bad decision. And honestly, if it isn't, I don't know what is. Because tackling the lopsided relationship between Spike and Cloves in Season 3 in a way that could offer Spike a real look at what the love of his life is actually like, rather than feebly doing so some 5 seasons later with Shoe on the other hoof, would have given this fractured rendition some meat on its bones to exercise with. Instead, we get an awful showcase that consistently pushes and subsequently breaks two earnest and strong-willed characters against each other, and produces nothing but piles of unremarkable and cringe-worthy rubbish that impacts Spike to damage his already neutered capability to extreme ends. Altogether, it's just awkward and hardly does anything to make you smile. Sure, it starts and ends with the Timberwolves 3D skeletons sticking out of the usual 2D form, but it was really all this had to hold up high. It just didn't make the effort to even have Spike's fabricated dragon code feel like it was worth something, as the episode served up as a putrid pile of poor products across the board. It's a shame that it failed so badly by not providing the character development and intrigue that it promised, especially how easily it would have been to fix. However, it's easy to see why many in the fandom, including myself, hate it as much as we do. It ruins characters, it does barely anything to keep your attention, and relies too much on a snazzy visual element to prop up its own limp corpse. Good thing I've taken it to the morgue before it stank up the place. It's easy to see that early on in this show's run, they'd find a reason to do pretty much anything with its characters as long as it made sense to their core values and their long-term objectives. While this did have some high points, when it went pear-shaped, it felt absolutely terrible, especially when a 22-minute episode feels like 40 when it took recently established characters and sent them in the completely wrong direction. Let me introduce you to an episode that was at the bottom of my list for 4 fucking years. Deservedly so, I may add. Season 1's The Showstoppers actually started off well, giving us a fun-filled montage highlighting the Cutie Mark Crusaders' efforts to, well, find their cutie marks, set to one of the catchiest pieces of background music that William Anderson ever made, and I still love it to this day. If this was the entire episode, stretched out, focusing on a variety of adventures and hopelessness before a moral about not giving up on your dreams because they feel out of reach, I would be satisfied wholeheartedly and I wouldn't need to talk about this one. Instead, they cut that down and tried to superglue a talent contest onto it, and what we got was an unbalanced car crash that represented the characters at their most immature and lifeless. You see them actually prove to be good at something, yet completely ignore it in favour of going for their absolute weaknesses and making complete fools out of themselves. And well, to add a shit-stained cherry on top of the puke sundae, a musical number that makes my eardrums bleed. Why waste such a fantastic backing track on just such an awful piece of garbage that was done on purpose? Combine this awful attempt at comedy with a premise that half-bakes its own story relevance, with a moral about realizing where your strengths are completely falling on deaf ears, it is a recipe for disaster. Some people and fellow bronies do find this episode enjoyable, how I will never understand. It didn't take the CMCs long to escape this painfully unfunny, sloppily paced and hijacked mess of an episode, but it took even longer for me to find something worse. And the fact that this held my bottom spot for so long and it's not in the bottom 5 should be an indication of just how awful things are about to get. And to also think that William Anderson's score was the only thing that saved this one from oblivion. It's unbelievable to fathom. So here's a hot take you all may want to throttle me by the neck for saying: Season 4 is overrated and is in my opinion one of the worst that this show ever did. Now, I can hear and feel that hatred starting to boil over, but let me explain, I have my reasons. While there are some real gems of quality within its episode selection, especially when it comes to the 2 episodes that bookended the damn thing, when you look at what's in between, a lot of it is just mindless nothing that barely even lives up to its own expectations. And when you realise that the overarching narrative of Twilight coming to terms with being a royal in Equestria is rarely ever touched on outside of the premiere and the finale in the whole goddamn season, you start to realise that it never really achieved the goal that it set out. And yes, we did see in Twilight time how Book Horse was affected by being followed and paraded as something special by lots of people, but that was only a minor thing in the broader scale of the episode. To see it come through with some form of relevance, we have to wait until the 22nd episode, Tradia, an episode that honestly is the biggest definition of filler the show had done up until that point, and it needed a kick up the arse like this to at least give it an A and B plot to balance it. However, it tried to accommodate Twilight's development amidst an inconsequential dedication to trading, which was a senseless and volatile exercise in tepid and derisory execution. Even with something supporting it so valiantly, they ballsed it up, and boy was it painful to sit through. This is because Twilight's entire dilemma was not even at the forefront of this episode. Yeah, the core concept revolved around the trading, the rules of which were so unusual and conveniently exploitable that I immediately could see that there could be problems, and boy howdy was there. The characters facilitating said trades, most of which were our main 6, were as mind-bogglingly stupid as the items up for grabs, making every interaction and facilitation of conflict feel tedious, tepid, and eye-rollingly futile the longer they permeated through a lifeless husk of a setting that never really gave you much to scream about visually or audibly in the process. And forcibly shoehorning Twilight's dilemma to fuel its brain-dead message about understanding the value of something tried to save face, but all it did was bring the plot round to square one, feeling like you had wasted your time on all of its meager efforts. This was the episode that highlighted Season 4's overall misgivings by supplying us something that we never actually asked for. No laughs were had, no interesting situations were found, and you're honestly asking yourself constantly while seeing it, what purpose did any of it actually serve? To think that one of the lone bits of an overarching narrative outside those damn key teasers was found in something as unremarkable and teeth-grindingly boring as this. Someone didn't think things through well enough. And honestly, Tradia is a brain-dead husk that just leaves me with so little to say about it. It just exists, and that is honestly all I can say. It has virtually nothing of value, and even its negatives aren't even worth recounting, because they just staple down how unremarkable it is. And while other episodes featured the metaphorical keys that were essential to the season's finale, this just said, you know what, we're just going to tack it on because we've wasted time when we should have said something about Twilight earlier. I would have expected a bit more strength and cohesion from its episodes given the time they had to string ideas together, rather than wasting time on meaningless drivel like this. Tradia is an episode that actively goes out of its way to render itself as void, pointless, meaningless, and destitute as it could. And as a result, it's a good thing it ranked this low on the list. The same is true in all forms of narrative-driven media, whether it's visual or non-visual, physical or digital, interactive or passive, that if you create a story that makes legitimately no sense in terms of logical reasoning to the series and the world you have around you, then it will just crumble to pieces and find it very difficult to resurrect any form of positives. Now, this series especially has done that on many occasions where the stories will insult your intelligence in how they're constructed and played out. Sure, you can look at the age rating and the target demographic and go, I can understand why that's happened. It's still just no excuse for it, as far as I am concerned. Especially when those episodes have the groundwork there for making mediums of sense. Non-compete clause has two competitive ponies fighting with each other for superiority because they're egotists. You have a dragon who on one occasion has to try and sort out a long-standing conflict, which needs to be rectified at some point, and in the other, has an episode of continuity supporting the fact that he wants to be proving himself as a dragon in a world surrounded by ponies who are not the same species. At least that makes sense. The point of no return, however, that, ladies and gentlemen, in my humble opinion, takes the piss. Assuming that viewers would care about a book falling off a tower that was just out of shot in the series premiere some 7 years ago was extremely dense thinking on the writer's part, an attitude that would suffocate an unfunny, boring and hapless effort to string some form of life out of a premise that struggled for life to begin with, dragging along for the search of a librarian whose current face was always replaced with an old one to maintain a mystery that had no worth further added to its woes, whilst a moral about realising that you can't be perfect would have been appropriate in Season 4 at the height of Twilight's insecurities about her role and image, more so than Season 9 when most of her greatest fears and issues have already been defeated or resolved. Push all that together with nonsensically slow pacing and unfunny jokes, and it all just moulds itself into sublime idiocy that you've just got to marvel at. If it wasn't for the moral at least working functionally, the point of no return would have sank further down into the depths, a true representation of its eponymous title. This was the first taste I had that Season 9 would throw whatever idea it wanted at the wall and see what would stick. Sadly, this dribbled down the side of said wall, leaving an unpleasant stain behind in the process. Discord is a character loved by many, including one blue horse who stresses he's perfect in every single way, even though I digress, because his episode record proves otherwise. Yes, there have been some absolute triumphs for the Draconicus, but he has had some stinkers over the years. One, however, was so infamous that not even him turning in his best Bob Ross impression could save it from cataclysmically bombing. Hell, when you actually pull this one apart, you realise just how vapid, empty and utterly pointless it all is, to where even his costume changes and eccentric eloquence doesn't even muster a smirk. That is when you know you have a problem. Yes, for those of you who still haven't caught on, we are going to be talking about What About Discord. Get your boxing gloves ready, because this is going to be one hell of a beating. From the moment this episode gets rolling, we see characters who had a distrust for Discord as recently as Make New Friends But Keep Discord earlier on in the season are having laughs with him. It already feels off and smells funny, and having to painfully watch as Twilight tries in vain attempting to debunk all of this as a spell is just eye-wateringly terrible, especially as it drags on and on and on to where at its end we are robbed of the relief of the most obvious foreseeable climax ever, just to have the standard status quo weasel its way back in and my head hits the desk realizing I've wasted 22 minutes of my life on the most uneventful, boring and lazy episode I think this show has ever done. You couldn't think of anything more interesting than Discord having fun with ponies who usually hate his ass? Who the hell wrote this? Oh yeah, Neil Dusadow. This was the only episode that was solely written by you, and boy does it show a lack of anything remotely considered fun whenever John Delancey isn't trying to distract you with outfits, or Bob Ross, or whatever the blue hell this is. Sure, a moral cantering around not being jealous of missing out on other people's fun is a good one to teach the target audience, because they get picky at anything, but going on about it, showcasing it in such a brain-dead and blunt way makes even that lose any shred of value that it could have had, especially when it's revealed that Discord didn't even use a damn spell, which means everything we had seen makes no sense at all, in any form. If Discord had once again taught the Princess of Friendship that even she has an off day, I can at least get behind that, but putting the most appalling foot forward in the most limp way possible was no padding to at least support its mindless and directionless output. It just makes me hate it even more. Discord himself saved this episode from the absolute bottom, but even then I couldn't reward the most barren of episodes with more than the barest minimum possible after the torture that it put me through. What about Discord? It's an apt title, because what about Discord could you possibly make a better episode out of? Honestly, a lot of things. Sadly, none of it came to this guy. This episode's abysmal quality is damning, and I'm happy to know that it got this bronze medal position, because honestly, it bloody deserved it. When I first started analysing this show in 2015 and curated the scoring system that you are seeing now either side of me, I was hoping, in all hopes, that no episode of this show would ever get the lowest rating, because when you're reviewing something, you're hoping that nothing is that bad to where there is no redeemable qualities. Unfortunately, 2 episodes did that. Yes, 2 episodes getting 0 compared to the rest of it is much better than you'd expect. However, it is also the exact same amount of episodes that got the highest grade. So, you can see how much of an issue that is. However, it's easy enough to be happy that 2 episodes are officially the worst of the worst. It's another thing entirely when you have to try and split hairs between them and figure out which one is worse than the other. That proved very challenging. However, I was able to figure out exactly what one had over the other, and it's simple. Well, I mean, it's simple, but it's in the most minimalist of terms you could ever imagine. The number 2 entry on this list managed to secure its place because Smolder ranted at Rainbow Dash and the cheerleading uniform was aesthetically pleasing to the eye. If that is all you have to stand on, then Jesus Christ, you can tell just how low the bar is from here. Out of all of Season 9's misdeeds, giving us an episode so bereft of cohesion, concentration, and confident direction should have been criminal. Foregoing character development and conveniently forgetting the moral of a Season 8 episode to do so makes it even more egregious. 246 great! Supplied itself with cardinal sin after cardinal sin to leave me aghast at its woeful quality. Rainbow Dash's final solo enterprise was morally bankrupt. decisively festering in her own ego-driven self-importance to where it was painfully uninteresting, taking a premise that would have been fine if it was a frank character study and systematic deconstruction that it promised to be, yet instead it was a kamikaze pilot willing to take out all who accompanied this Wonderbolt on the journey with her. The Student 6's final appearance, albeit only with Smolder, Yona and Ocellus representing, was a painful afterthought, as they were mere passengers to Rainbow's stupefying display of posturing and ignorance, all while they stumbled over a lack of action to make you question their intentions more so. Then suddenly, a light bulb clicks, and they get things together to end on a happy note that feels so undeserved and underbaked that you feel robbed. It sets itself up decently in the first few minutes initially, but then it foregoes any sense of stability in favour of making the viewer immensely uncomfortable, which is not what you would want from a show such as this, that you can just sit back and enjoy yourself. I didn't do that on this occasion. Boy howdy I didn't. To have Snips prove also that he truly is the worst of his pair and probably outright the worst character the show has ever put together, as well as adding more inflammatory ingredients to the dumpster fire too, just makes me wince. The fact that the end in Friends moral had to be dug up and regurgitated with unpleasant results as this episode tried to sloppily justify its own existence further emblazons just how awful it is. The more I even remotely think about it, the more negative connotations are conjured up. If anyone ever asks me to define the term painfully unimaginative, this will be Exhibit A. 246 Great is an episode that had all the promise in the world, yet pissed it all away. For what? A chance to showcase Rainbow as a brash egotist one last time before the show's curtain fell, even though it was not bloody necessary? I still cannot get my head around that decision, as honestly, all the work that they had done to make Rainbow Dash's character at least a pleasant one, was just washed away. This episode lacked in substance, forethought, and intelligence throughout, with unpleasant character portrayals and a feebly foreshadowable outcome that leaves you literally grasping at straws. It further rammed home the misgivings of the final season, where missed opportunities stung far more than others prior. I've highlighted through both parts of this countdown that lost potential has been the death knell for many an episode, but this one, however, squandered it to the largest detriment of its own quality, which at the end of the day is just sad to even imagine. If you're looking at what's left of this video and wondering, good lord, why is he spending so much time on the number one entry? That's because I've never had the chance to speak about it before, and I want to give it all I've got. After I finished reviewing 246 Great last year, I thought to myself that no episode would ever be as bad as it. I was so confident I was willing to bet my life on it. However, at the time, I hadn't finished analysing or critiquing Season 5 for my records. And well, despite the poor quality of some of Season 5's episodes, I was certain that even after What About Discord's predictably abysmal showing, that the Rainbow Dash cheerleading calamity would remain the lowest of the low. Unfortunately, an episode that I had completely forgotten about came out of the woodwork and profoundly shocked me at just how awful it was. After going through it, it was no wonder that I forgot about it, because it would be much easier to scrub it from my memory than dare reference it again. That episode reared its ugly head and snatched the number one spot from what I believed was its rightful owner. I feel dirty just thinking about this episode, let alone talking about it, but I have to. This list has to end on an applicable note, and there's no better representation of the worst that this show has ever given me than an episode that jumped into a pile of manure at the first time of asking and didn't look back. In my opinion, the worst episode of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic is Princess Spike. I've already alluded to this show's poor quality when it's at its most asinine, lazy, and profoundly morose. This, however, takes the cake, then eats it, then summarily defecates, and subsequently eats what it shat out before repeating the process over and over, infinitely, ad nauseum, until the nauseum collapses in on itself and creates a black hole that encompasses all around it. If the only thing worth remembering is Twilight clambering over a pile of books like a dragon right before the episode kicks into first gear, then you immediately know that something is off. Little did I know that it would be the whole damn thing. The concept of Twilight hosting a friendship summit was something that at least grasped your interest, right before it decided to take said interest and feed it into a goddamn wood chipper. Not only was Twilight incapable of supporting it because she was asleep for the entire thing, but left Spike up to the daunting task of standing in for and accepting the responsibility of her title, hitting brick wall after brick wall as the narrative set up nonsensically convenient roadblocks that made me facepalm into another dimension for the second time. Anything remotely minor was fixated upon to where they would eventually, and predictably go wrong, sleepwalking you to a conclusion that sapped any potential excitement out of you, the ignorance of which further brought Spike into the firing line of all who even dared to look at him, as the attitudes of all the characters at and around said summit was brought into disrepute. They conveniently forgot that there were 3 other bastard royals present to get guidance and assistance from, yet they only decided to hit Twilight's word on anything, which left me flabbergasted at their ignorance as it set up Spike's painfully inevitable failure on both moral and logistical grounds, as all shit hit the fan and created a mess so awful that not even Scruffy from Futurama would clean it up, even if you paid him a fucking fortune to do so. All of which, unsurprisingly, led to our living, breathing, capable hero trope of a princess to actually wake up and do her job of reconciling a situation before giving Spike a dressing down that served no real purpose other than to tie the most thinly veiled attempt at a moral to a story that stank of sour milk long before it had even reached the end of its sell-by date, as it drowned in an absolute cesspool of confusing and frustrating delivery. This was only amplified by having literally no animation or musical notes to speak of throughout to further compound its misery. When all was said and done, no character benefited from anything that occurred. No entertainment was even remotely created, and at the end of the day, Spike, a character whose grave was already dug, proceeded to bury himself alive, relying on betraying the moral that Secret of My Excess made to flesh out an episode that clearly had no direction or reason or rhyme from the start. It was just so painful to witness, it hurt so much, all while giving Princess Cadence the chance to actually stand her ground and do something meaningful for once, only for her to completely botch it. And what hurts even more is that all of this occurred before the Friendship Summit even bloody started, meaning that all we saw was the precursor to an event we never see anything more of. Talk about an absolutely colossal waste of time, where any form of investment was rewarded with the swift kick to the genitals. This episode is a profound insult to many a fan's senses and outright one of the most unpleasant viewing experiences I've ever had watching anything. And given my issues of social anxiety and watching conflict in general happen in fictional media, that's a big statement for me to make. I know there have been examples of sheer incompetence when it comes to episodes of this show, but this is something else, where even on a basic storytelling level, there is nothing of substance at all. And the fact that this happened for a product that was made in 2015 that had a history of solid returns on that front, oh my god, it just makes me really question how the hell this was written by 3 to 4 people. How did you come up with this? I don't understand it, and it makes me want to put my fingers straight into my eyes to the point where I put my brain into fucking comatose. It takes such a substantial lack of creativity to even put this to film, especially when you realize that if they at least lived up to the episode's title and turned Spike into a pony to facilitate all this, then at least I would have had something to talk about. Something that could have made this interesting and fun. Instead, a character who had already taken beating after beating, season after season, was provided with this show's equivalent of the bubonic plague and left to wallow in agony until the credits rolled. It's just unbelievable. And when I look at it, Princess Spike stands out for all the wrong reasons. Renders itself as the most worthless of all of its contemporaries, and in the most damning action of all, sent Season 5 into a disruptive tailspin that took many episodes to even remotely recover from it. It was an episode that I can never knowingly watch again without remembering just how unforgivingly abysmal it truly is. If you don't agree, re-watch this rotting carcass back to see for yourself just how its turgidly foul stench makes your eyes water and your brain ache. In closing, once everything was laid out on the table, it was no wonder that Princess Spike left with the shit-stained wooden spoon. Painfully unimaginative in its storytelling and characterization, and unfulfilled on so many levels in its visual and audible tendencies, with a moral that just felt like it was stapled as an amendment prior to it going to the committee to ratify it. It just showed what can happen if those writing a show for children just feel like they can just chuck plot elements into a pot, mix it up together, and see what comes out of it, no matter how acrid it tastes. And I just thought to myself, when 246 Great got that lowest score, that, yeah, an episode with potential that fails is utterly reprehensible, but an episode that doesn't even try, an episode that does not even have a basis for being a thing at all, yet still happens and has negative effects on everything it touches across the board, there was no better choice to be the worst My Little Pony Friendship is Magic episode out there. And if you believe that I have made a mistake, the comments section is open and ready for some discourse. And well, that's it. The worst episodes have been catalogued and have been filed away accordingly. Now all I have to do is ensure that the opposite end of things gets tied up in equally appropriate fashion. I've been Freddie Thomas, you've been people watching, this is the CC Network, and I will see you all next time.